everyone, Ewan from What Culture Comics here, and I don't know if you know, but 2021 is a big year for DC Comics for plenty of reasons, but one of the main ones being that it's the 10-year anniversary of the New 52, the publisher's ambitious reboot that is still affecting them on and off the page after all this time. This year has already proven to be a year of big change for DC. The house of Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman has experienced massive ructions as a direct result of the pandemic, breaking ranks away from Diamond Distribution in 2020, but then also suffering massive losses behind the scenes, with AT&T and Time Warner, their parent company, gutting DC Collectibles and much of the publisher's editorial staff. But for all that behind-the-scenes tumult has arguably defined DC in the pandemic era, the publisher's actual comics output has been met with repeated praise from readers and critics alike. Black Label has continuously delivered on the promise of exciting, creator-focused works unshackled by continuity restrictions in more traditional superhero fare, while Future State, although very much a watered-down version of the ambitious 5G reboot that was ostensibly shelved in the wake of Dan Didio's firing, has also proven to be a reinvigorating addition to the DC universe. Future State was fresh and exciting, breaking with the status quo by introducing new characters that sported bold new designs and premises, but it's been quickly followed by Infinite Frontier, the latest in a long line of initiatives from the publisher that have vowed to reclaim the magic and optimism, the tonal uniqueness that makes DC so DC that has supposedly absented their comics over the preceding decade. Now, readers could be forgiven for rolling their eyes at Infinite Frontier, if nothing else than because it's vowing to do the same thing that Doomsday Clock promised 2 years ago, which in essence merely echoed the same thing DC Rebirth introduced a further 3 years before that. The quality is still there, of course, and it's probably even fair to say that we're seeing one of DC's most creative periods in years, but the message is clear. DC as a publisher is struggling to find its identity some 10 years after embarking on its riskiest ever experiment, the New 52. Introduced in 2011, the New 52 was an ambitious plan headed up by DC editorial to revitalize the company, who were continuously lagging behind Marvel in terms of sales month after month. Anxiety stemmed from a multitude of reasons, whether it be that the characters themselves were too old, their continuity too complex, or that the overall aesthetic was dated. There was an idea that DC was failing to resonate outside of its core audience, and that it had to do something different, drastic even, to stand a chance of increasing the publisher's share of the market and denting some of Marvel's dominance. The New 52 was meant to address all of these concerns, hitting a hard reset on DC's decade-spanning continuity and carving out a new aesthetic to make it more accessible to new readers. 52 brand new number ones were drawn up, some taking place in the formative stages of this new continuity, but others mostly in the present. It was met with some pushback from readers, myself included, but whatever. The reboot became an instant success when it launched in August 2011, outselling Marvel throughout the end of 2011 and 2012, and by all accounts having the desired effect of bringing in new readers, which I should reiterate is a really good thing. The reboot was not without controversy though, and by 2013, Marvel had all but reasserted their dominance in the direct market. Numerous editorial fallouts led to creators leaving DC, and some changes to the characters were also poorly received. There was a distinct lack of women involved on the creative level too, which only made the fact that several New 52 titles were criticized for regurgitating stale misogynistic comic book tropes all the more galling. Factor in confusion regarding the new continuity, as DC struggled to define what was and wasn't actually still canon with the reboot, public fallouts from writers with editorial, and numerous other issues, and it would be fair to say that the New 52, despite its initial success, was fairly divisive. It's also the single most important event DC has experienced in the 21st century. The New 52 laid the foundations of not only a new era in the publisher's comics, but of DC in film too. We see its legacy in animation, and even in the DC Extended Universe, and that's interesting, because it's also a reboot DC is now desperately trying to escape, at least as far as the comics are concerned. And look, before I get into this massive old big deep dive into the New 52, I do want to say this as well. If you you love the New 52, if the reboot is what got you into comics and you actually really love this interpretation of the DC universe, then I'm genuinely really happy for you. I think that's really cool. I'm not trying to gatekeep anything here or invalidate these stories in any way whatsoever, but equally, I do think it's worth acknowledging that the New 52 is tonally anomalous when you consider DC as a whole. There's been a recognition from the publisher that the New 52 fundamentally changed the identity of their comics even as early as 6 years ago, and it's an internal conflict that's playing out close to a decade on from its introduction. Okay, so to put the New 52 into further context, back in 2011, DC was lagging behind main competitor Marvel in terms of overall market share. There were occasional months where the distinguished competition was able to outperform the House of Ideas, but for the most part, Marvel retained a share of the market that was far greater than DC's own, averaging between 38.23% and 43.35% of the dollar market share and unit market share, compared to DC's 30.39 and 34.0 in 2010, according to Diamond, a year before DC's reboot would actually drop. Previous years paint a similar picture, with Marvel retaining the top spot and DC coming in behind in a not too distant second, but always with a big enough gap to never really trouble their biggest rivals. It was with this in mind that DC editorial, headed up then by Dan Didio, Jeff Johns, and Jim Lee, resolved to try something drastic. The idea was that DC needed to appeal to new readers if it was ever going to close the distance on Marvel, and to do that, changes had to be made. Big changes. DC's characters were frequently criticized for being everything Marvel's heroes weren't, and although any DC reader will tell you that's a spectacular error to make, it's a perception that's persisted all the same, along with other such takes as Superman isn't relatable and Aquaman talks to fish. It's bollocks. So yeah, all the noise about DC at the time was pointing towards the idea that the publisher's comics were simply too difficult to approach as a new reader, or even that their characters were out of date. Years of contradictory retcons and crises had seemingly erected barriers around the DC universe as it then existed, which meant that, if DC ever wished to catch up with Marvel, a change in direction was deemed necessary. This direction was, according to Didio in a 2011 interview with the Washington Post, spearheaded by Johns and Lee. Both had been key figures at the publisher for years by that point, the former famous more for his work reshaping the Green Lantern and the Flash, and the latter more so for their time spent with Marvel and Image in the 1990s. Johns' DNA was especially woven into the fabric of the New 52 as the publisher's chief creative officer, with the writer continuing his work on Green Lantern, but also joining Lee on Justice League, and then Ivan Reis on Aquaman. It's also important to note that Johns himself would become heavily involved in DC film, where he would serve as a key architect of the DC Extended Universe alongside filmmaker Zack Snyder, which was developed concurrently alongside the New 52, which we'll come back to later on. In 2011, Johns and artist Andy Kubert launched a series that would directly lead into the New 52 with Flashpoint, a Flash-oriented comic that saw Barry Allen shatter the multiverse in a desperate bid to save his mother from being murdered by arch-nemesis Eobard Thawne. The New 52 was announced shortly after the release of Flashpoint's first issue, with DC revealing all of their titles would be cancelled and replaced with 52 new number ones, and that a quote-unquote more modern, diverse DC universe would be introduced along with them. In this case, the intent was clear. When Didio claimed in the aforementioned Washington Post interview that one of the reasons for the reboot was down to writers feeling quote-unquote trapped in the past, that same anecdote ended with the editor telling those same writers to look to a new audience. These sentiments were echoed in pretty much all the publicity that accompanied the New 52's announcement, with USA Today mentioning how Lee's redesigned looks were designed to make characters more identifiable and accessible to comic fans new and old. You see, the new universe conceived by Johns and Lee did away with much of the backstory for certain characters and reset numerous relationships back to square one. This also had the effect of making some characters near enough unrecognizable. Superman and Lois Lane were no longer married, as was the case with numerous other iconic couples, while Green Arrow also suffered the misfortune of losing not only his iconic Van Dyke beard, but his relationship with Black Canary, a key change DC made a point of reversing yet again for DC Rebirth. Figuring out what to keep and what to change also kind of effectively rendered the entire New 52 reset somewhat pointless. The idea was to entice new readers in with a streamlined continuity, and yet numerous events from the old universe remained intact, despite the fact the quote-unquote present version of the timeline was only 5 years old. Batman was by far the worst to suffer from this, with the Caped Crusader having supposedly lived through the events of the Killing Joke, Nightfall, and Final Crisis, I mean, sort of, whilst also training several Robins in that short space of time. The reboot, and I will never forgive it for this, also disrupted Grant Morrison's run on Batman, with Batman Incorporated being shoehorned into the new canon when it could have quite happily existed outside of it. DC Editorial attempted to make the timeline more navigable by clarifying which stories were and weren't canon shortly after the reboot began, but the truth was that the new continuity was just as confusing as the old one, only with no other character development to go along with it. But if the foundations of the new universe itself were rocky, that was nothing compared to the many controversies that were occurring off the page. Just 1% of all the creators involved in the New 52 were women, and this was exacerbated by several misogynistic and sexist tropes featured in its stories. Scott Lobdell's frankly diabolical Red Hood and the Outlaws series kicked off its opening arc with a leering portrayal of Starfire, while Judd Winnick's Catwoman also debuted with a gratuitous rooftop meetup between her and Batman. Add to that a disastrous retconned origin for Wonder Woman in Brian Azzarello's run on the character, which recast the Amazons as rapist pillagers, and you only begin to scratch the surface of just how bad the New 52's attitude towards women was, both on and off the page. Arguably the most damning controversies, though, manifested at the editorial level. Gail Simone, who was acclaimed for her work on Birds of Prey and Secret Six prior to the reboot, was unceremoniously fired from the main Batgirl title, only to be rehired straight after due to fan backlash. Simone's trouble with DC Editorial was emblematic of wider conflicts that took place across the publisher throughout the New 52, with arguably the most significant coming when Hayden Blackman and J.H. Williams III ended their seminal run on Batwoman early because DC wouldn't let Kate Kane marry longtime love interest Maggie Sawyer. I'm still so annoyed about that. Dan Didio attempted to explain the reasoning behind the decision at San Diego Comic-Con 2013, and in doing so, accidentally typified what made the New 52 such a miserable endeavor for so many readers. Heroes shouldn't have personal lives, Didio said. That is our mandate, that is our edict, and that is our stand. What a motto. DC Comics. Heroes don't have happy personal lives. It's really inspiring. But yeah, DC's refusal to allow Kane and Sawyer to marry just summed up how thoroughly not DC the New 52 was. The whole reboot was an exercise in trying to do something different, whether that be aesthetically, tonally, or narratively, but as the publisher would come to understand, it came at the cost of DC's identity and ultimately had to be changed yet again. By 2015, the New 52 experiment had all but come to an end. Marvel had regained its dominant place in the direct market, and this forced DC Editorial to ask some difficult questions. About a year later, DC began a new reboot called DC Rebirth in a bid to recapture what had been lost for the New 52. As Dan Didio explained to Abraham Reisman for New York Magazine a few months after Rebirth's launch, there was a disconnect with the fanbase, more than we'd ever perceived. It felt palpable. Nobody was really into the stories. We might have gone a little bit too far with some of the New 52 stories and lost the connective tissue that people really use to identify with our characters. Rebirth was, in essence, a course correction for the publisher. Things didn't go back to how they were, but there was an acknowledgement that, whatever the New 52 was, it wasn't what drew readers to DC in the first place. Rebirth released to critical acclaim in 2016, featuring a dynamic lineup of creative teams and comics, and though it hasn't been all smooth sailing since, the publisher has since enjoyed one of its most imaginative periods in recent years, leading into the exciting Future State event at the beginning of 2020, as well as the ongoing Infinite Frontier. And this isn't to say the New 52 was a complete bust either, because it obviously wasn't. In unpacking the legacies of the 5-year-long initiative, fans can point towards clear successes like Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo's Batman, or Jimmy Palmiotti and Amanda Connor's Harley Quinn, both really good series that ended on redefining those characters in many different ways. The problem is that there didn't have to be a massive reboot for these series to exist, although no one can contest its achievement in bringing in new readers for the publisher. By far the two most fascinating aspects of the fallout of the New 52, though, has been seeing its principal architect, Geoff Johns, reckon with its legacy, as well as the fact it's now weirdly the predominant version of DC in wider media. Johns used the ill-considered watch and follow-up Doomsday Clock to unpack the changes he himself introduced via the New 52. The story reveals how it was Dr. Manhattan all along who had been behind the changes to the timeline with the New 52, but after being confronted with the negative effects of those changes, he begins to restore the old universe back to its former self. Icky use of Watchmen aside, it was also during this time that Johns stepped down from his roles as Chief Creative Officer and President of DC Entertainment, which saw him heavily involved in the construction of Warner Bros. DC Extended Universe franchise alongside filmmaker Zack Snyder. The DCEU is, in many ways, a product of the New 52. Although Snyder's Batman takes massive amounts of inspiration from Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, some would say too much, most of everything else audiences have seen in DC film over the last decade were articulated first back in that 2011 reboot. Whether that's Cyborg being a member of the Justice League and not a Teen Titan, or Darkseid being inextricably linked to the former team's origin. Even Warner Bros. Animation looked to synergize its efforts with the reboot from 2012 onwards, starting its own animated universe that pretty much exclusively adapted New 52 comics, rather than the broader approach taken in the years prior. The truly weird thing about all of this, though, is that the New 52, despite being a thing recognized by DC Comics as something largely unrepresentative of what DC should be, has been governing the majority of the publisher's efforts in film and TV since about 2012. There has been somewhat of a change since Patty Jenkins' Wonder Woman released in 2017, with James Gunn's Suicide Squad reboot taking more inspiration from John Ostrander's comics than elsewhere, but on the whole, the shadow of the New 52 continues to loom large over the publisher, most recently and prevalently in the fan campaign and then release of Zack Snyder's Justice League. For as much as it is important to emphasize the significance of the New 52 as a flashpoint for DC Comics as a whole, however, it's also worth bearing in mind that these conflicts have been playing out across DC for years before that reboot came to pass. In 1996, Mark Waid and Alex Ross co-authored Kingdom Come, a series that offered a commentary on how the superheroes of the 1990s had lost their way as a result of hyper-stylized violence and edginess. In 2005, Geoff Johns penned Infinite Crisis, a series largely about how DC superheroes, and by extent the publisher, had lost their way due to darkness. The New 52 gave way to Rebirth, and Rebirth's decline gave way to Infinite Frontier, each series reaffirming a mission statement to recapture a spark that had ostensibly gone missing at some point in time. It's likely, if not downright inevitable, I mean, come on, this is superhero comics after all, that these relaunches and events will continue in a cyclical pattern for many years to come, but equally, there's still no overstating the significance of the New 52. It represents DC's own identity crisis, and one that's still playing out across the company's comics, films, and related media. And yeah, that was my look back at the New 52 and how it continues to affect DC even a decade after its introduction. What are your thoughts on the reboot? Let me know in the comments below, and please don't forget to drop the video a like if you enjoyed it, and to subscribe to Wild Culture Comics so you don't miss another upload going forward. That's all for now though, I've been Ewan, and I will see you next time. Bye!